In 1690, a cloistered nun in Mexico City owned 4,000 books. That's more than most European universities at the time. Her name was Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and she used that library to write feminist poetry, conduct scientific experiments, and compose a letter so devastating to the Catholic Church's position on women that bishops are still arguing about it today. But here's what nobody tells you. The real story of how she got there and what the Church did to silence her is far stranger than any legend. And almost everything you think you know about women in colonial Mexico is wrong. Let's start with the myth. The version most people carry around in their heads, if they've heard of colonial Latin America at all, goes something like this. Spain conquered Mexico. The Catholic Church locked everything down. Women were property. Indigenous culture was erased. For 300 years, nothing intellectually interesting happened until independence movements shook things up. Women in particular had two options, marriage or the convent. Either way, silence. Either way, obedience. Either way, intellectual death. And if you've heard of Sor Juana at all, the popular version of her story fits neatly into that framework. She was a tragic genius, a woman born in the wrong century, a candle snuffed out by the patriarchy. Poor, doomed, brilliant, defeated. A symbol of oppression. That version is comfortable. It confirms what we already believe about colonial societies. It lets us feel appropriately outraged and then move on. But it is also, in almost every important detail, misleading. Because Sor Juana wasn't a helpless victim trapped by her era. She was a strategic, politically savvy intellectual powerhouse who manipulated the very systems that were supposed to contain her. And she didn't just survive in colonial Mexico. For nearly 3 decades, she thrived. Juana Inés de Asbaje y Ramírez de Santillana was born around 1648 in a small village southeast of Mexico City. Her mother was likely illiterate. Her father was absent. She was, by the standards of her time, illegitimate. She had precisely 0 advantages, except one. She was terrifyingly intelligent. By her own account, she learned to read at the age of 3 by following her older sister to lessons and convincing the teacher she'd been sent by her mother. At 6 or 7, she heard that the University of Mexico existed in the capital, and she begged her mother to dress her as a boy so she could attend. Her mother refused, so Juana did what Juana always did. She found another way. She devoured her grandfather's library. She taught herself Latin. She reportedly punished herself by cutting her own hair when she failed to master a subject quickly enough, reasoning that a head so slow to learn didn't deserve the adornment. By the time she was a teenager, her reputation reached the Viceroy's court in Mexico City. The Viceroy and his wife, fascinated by rumors of this prodigy from the countryside, brought her to court as a lady-in-waiting. And then the Viceroy did something remarkable. He assembled a panel of 40 scholars, theologians, mathematicians, poets, and philosophers, and he challenged this teenage girl to face them all in an intellectual examination. She didn't just pass. According to witnesses, she dismantled every challenge they threw at her. One observer compared it to a royal galleon fending off tiny canoes. She was 17. Now here's where the myth says she was forced into the convent because she had no other choice. The reality? She chose it. Deliberately, strategically. Marriage would have meant surrendering her time, her books, her intellectual freedom to a husband and domestic obligations. The convent of San Jeronimo, on the other hand, offered something almost unimaginable for a woman in the 17th century. A private apartment, servants, visitors, and most critically, time to study. Here's the second myth we need to demolish. We picture convents as grim, silent cells where women shuffled around in perpetual misery. Some were, certainly, but San Jeronimo in Mexico City was something else entirely. It was closer to a university campus than a prison. Nuns maintained private living quarters, some with multiple rooms. They had servants and slaves, which is its own deeply uncomfortable truth about colonial society that we shouldn't romanticize. They hosted visitors in parlors. They held musical performances. They exchanged letters and manuscripts with intellectuals across the Spanish Empire. And Sor Juana turned her cell into a laboratory and a salon. She accumulated those 4,000 volumes. She collected musical and scientific instruments. She conducted experiments in physics and natural philosophy. She once reportedly observed the properties of a spinning top and related them to geometric principles. She studied the acoustics of cathedral architecture. She wrote about the chemistry of cooking, arguing that if Aristotle had spent time in a kitchen, he would have written far more. That line alone tells you everything about her temperament. She wasn't humble about her intellect, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Meanwhile, she was producing an astonishing body of literary work, love poetry, philosophical sonnets, comedic plays, allegorical dramas that blended Aztec mythology with Catholic theology in ways that made church censors deeply uncomfortable. Her poem Hombres Necios, or Foolish Men, directly attacked the hypocrisy of men who blamed women for the very behavior men demanded from them. In the 17th century, 300 years before mainstream feminism had a name, she wrote in Spanish. She wrote in Latin. She wrote in Nahuatl. She was arguably the most important literary figure in the Americas during her lifetime, and she knew it. Now we reach the confrontation. And the myth here is that the church simply crushed her because that's what the church did to uppity women. The reality is far more interesting because it involves politics, jealousy, and a trap. In 1690, the Bishop of Puebla, Manuel Fernández de Santa Cruz, published a private theological critique Sor Juana had written about a famous sermon. But he published it without her permission and attached his own letter, written under a female pseudonym, Sor Filotea, gently suggesting that Sor Juana should spend less time on secular studies and more time on prayer. It was a public rebuke disguised as sisterly advice, and it was almost certainly a political move in a larger power struggle between rival church factions that Sor Juana had been drawn into. Sor Juana's response is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of Western thought. The Respuesta a Sor Filotea, the response to Sister Filotea, written in 1691, is part autobiography, part legal brief, part philosophical treatise, and entirely devastating. She methodically argued for women's right to education. She cited dozens of historical examples of learned women, from antiquity through church history. She pointed out that St. Paul's instruction for women to be silent in churches was about specific liturgical settings, not a universal ban on women thinking. She argued that studying secular subjects was necessary to understand sacred ones, that knowledge was interconnected, and that denying women access to learning was not pious but ignorant. And then she got personal. She described being persecuted not for her sins, but for her intelligence. She wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that she had been punished not for what she did wrong, but for what she did right. She said her greatest crime was simply being good at thinking. The letter circulated widely. It was brilliant, measured, and unanswerable. And it made very powerful men very angry. What happened next remains one of history's genuine mysteries. Between 1693 and her death in 1695, Sor Juana appears to have stopped writing entirely. She reportedly sold or gave away her library, all 4,000 volumes, along with her scientific and musical instruments. She signed documents of penance in her own blood. The myth says she was broken, forced into submission, crushed by guilt, and maybe that's partly true. But scholars have debated this for centuries, and the evidence isn't simple. Some argue she was coerced, threatened with inquisitorial investigation, and forced to capitulate. Others suggest her silence was itself a protest, a refusal to write under conditions she found intolerable, which is a very different thing from surrender. Still others point to political upheaval in Mexico City during those years, including famine and riots, that may have shifted the ground beneath her. What we do know is that in April 1695, an epidemic swept through San Jeronimo. Sor Juana, who had been caring for her sick sisters, contracted the illness and died. She was 46 years old. The myth wants her story to end in tragedy, and there is tragedy in it. But reducing Sor Juana to a victim erases the 3 decades during which she was the most celebrated intellectual in the Western Hemisphere. She didn't fail. She succeeded spectacularly, publicly, and for a remarkably long time in a world that was designed to make her success impossible. The real question isn't why she fell silent at the end. It's how she managed to be so loud for so long. Today, Sor Juana's face is on the 200 peso note in Mexico. Her former convent is a university campus. Her works are studied in literature departments on every continent. And her Respuesta is taught as a foundational text in feminist philosophy, right alongside Wollstonecraft and de Beauvoir, authors who came a century or more after her. She built a life of the mind inside an institution designed to contain her body. She argued for women's intellectual equality using the church's own sources against it. She wrote love poetry that scholars still argue about, debating whether the objects of her affection were real or metaphorical, male or female. She did all of this in colonial Mexico, in the 17th century, without a formal education, without a degree, without permission. So the next time someone tells you that feminism is a modern invention, or that the colonial world was an intellectual wasteland, or that one person can't challenge an entire system, tell them about the nun with 4,000 books. Now I want to hear from you. Drop in the comments the strangest fact you know about a historical figure who was way ahead of their time. I guarantee there are stories out there I haven't covered yet, and yours might end up in a future video. And if this is the kind of history that keeps you watching, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.